Hey, my name is Gaia Athena and today I'm bringing you my 2018 reading summary. This will contain quite a lot of graphs, so let's get started. This graph shows you the amount of books I've read in each year since I started to keep track. I started to keep track of how many books I read in June 2012, so that's why the first bit is June to December for 2012. In 2018 I read 263 books. This was a little bit more than in 2017, but less than in 2016 and 2015, and it is somewhat comparable to 2014. But how many books I read is really also dependent on what kind of books I read, so it doesn't say everything, I feel. Either way, I'm pretty pleased with how many books I read this year. I was hoping to at least get to 250 because I think that's a nice number, and I did, so I'm pretty happy about that. This graph shows you the amount of pages I read per year, and in 2018 I read 60,308 pages. I wanted to get to 60,000 and I did, so that was pretty good. As in the previous graph, the year I read the most pages and books was 2015. But like I said, it also really depends on what kind of books I read. For example, in June to December 2012, this was before I discovered the online book world and blogs and booktube and all that. I was mainly reading big fantasy books with no illustrations. In 2014, I think I became a member of the library. At the end of 2014 possibly, and so in 2015 I read a lot of children's books with illustrations from the library, and the same for 2016. This year I've read quite a few graphic novels. Anyway, you'll see more of those stats later. So yeah, I was pretty pleased with the number for this year. I thought it was more than last year, and yeah, I was pretty happy with it. This pie chart shows you the amount of new to me books that I read versus the amount of rereads. I reread 23 books in 2018, and one book was a combination. That was Heartstopper Volume 1 by Alice Oseman, because I had read part of this book before and part of the book was new to me, so I called it a combination. This pie chart shows you how many books I read that were physical and how many were digital. The majority of my reading were physical books and only 20 books were digital books. It is just my preference to read physical books. I generally only read digital books if there is no physical version. I don't read any audiobooks. In this graph you can see sort of where I get the books from that I read in 2018. Most of them were books that I owned. Some of them came from the library, and a couple came from the author's website, or I loaned books from others. In previous years this graph has looked quite different because I used to use the library more. I would like to go to the library a bit more in 2019, but then I also want to read my own books, so we'll see what happens. My preferred format for reading books is paperback, and it is then not a surprise to me that more than half of the books I read in 2018 were paperbacks. However, I also read quite a few hardbacks with no dust jacket. A portion of these are library books because most library books in the Netherlands are hardbacks without a dust jacket. In the Netherlands they kind of put the original cover, they put it on the book. So what was on the dust jacket, they put it on the book, and if it was a paperback, they put it on the book. So library copies or ex-library books, they are usually hardbacks, and then some children's books and other books sometimes are also hardbacks. I read some hardcovers as well. I've gotten more into that this year because I like to read some new releases as well. I read a few books on my Kindle and a couple of books from the author's website, which was mainly short stories through newsletters and stuff like that. This year I read more female authors than male authors. I also read some books that had multiple authors with different genres. I read 2 books written by non-binary authors, or authors that identify with gender in a different way. And of 2 books, so 2 authors, I did not know what gender they were, and I was unable to find this information, so I've classed them as unknown. In 2018, I gravitated more towards reading books by female authors, but this might look different in other years. This graph shows you the nationality of the author, or rather the country that they are from. It is a little bit hard to see what's in this graph, but I hope that I can explain it a little bit. Quite a few authors that I read books from were from the United States. Then we have a portion from the United Kingdom, also a portion from the Netherlands, and also some from Japan. And then we also have some smaller contributions. So I read a few books from Italy, a few from Belgium, a few from Australia, a few from Canada, a few from France, 1 from Ireland, 1 from China, 1 from Argentina, 1 from Poland, Turkey, South Africa, and Sweden. Those were all 1. And then there were 8 books that were a combination of countries. So usually those are books that have multiple authors from different countries, or authors that kind of grew up in one country and then moved to another, or things like that. It is almost an even split between new authors and familiar authors, with a small percentage being a combination of authors. I read 9 books that were a combination of a new and familiar author, so books that were written by more than one author, in which I knew like one author and not the other, things like that. I tried out quite a few new authors in 2018, but I also read some books by familiar authors because I like these authors, so I read more of their books. In previous years, I think I tried out less new authors and I read more familiar authors, but I like that I tried out some new authors this year. This graph showed you that out of all the books I read, most of them were standalones, but some, about a third, belonged to series, and then also a bunch of them were a combination, because some books are part of a series or use those characters, but you can still read the story as a standalone. An example are some children's books in which you can easily read each book on its own, and so I decided to put those as a combination. Also, some mystery books can be read like on their own and are like set mysteries on their own. So I've classified it as a series book when there is really like growth in the characters and where it's really important that you read them as a series, or it refers to events that happened earlier, and as a standalone when it is completely a standalone, but in a few cases I put combination. A last portion of the books I read in 2018 were novels. 11% of them were either short stories or a short story collection. Then 8 of the books I read came from omnibuses. I read a couple of novellas. I read some information books. I read some biographies and memoirs. I read a couple of picture books. This graph shows the genres that I read this year. So I read 44 fantasy books, 22 science fiction books, 100 contemporary fiction books, and I thought it was interesting that it happened to be exactly 100. 12 rom-coms, 2 historical fiction, 6 literature, which are mainly, I think, literary thrillers, where it says on the Dutch book that it's a literary thriller. 9 detectives and mysteries, 10 thrillers, 6 horror, 3 paranormal, 45 biographies and memoirs, and 19 information books, and 1 Disney book, which is the Donald Duck book that I read. I classified that as Disney. So yeah, this was, I think, a nice spread of genres. When we look at the pie charts for pages per genre, we can see that the ratios of what I've read becomes a little bit different, because for some genres the books are generally shorter than for other genres. This graph shows you what format kind of books I read. So I read 124 textbooks, which are, yeah, your usual books that mainly consist of text and don't have many illustrations. Then I read 44 illustrated books. I read 35 manga books. I read 8 comics or books based on comics. And I read 49 graphic novels and graphic memoirs. And then I read 3 picture books. In terms of age ranges, I read 3 books for infants. Those are those picture books I just talked about. I read 67 children's books. So children's books, I caught anything between like for ages 4 through 12, with kind of split between like 4 to 8 and 8 to 12, but I didn't specifically catalog that separately. And then young adult, which is 68, and I call that anywhere between ages 12 to 18. I know some people might say only 15 to 18 is young adult. I use my library classification, which this is how they catalog it. So yeah. And then 125 books for adults. And I was quite surprised by this because in previous years I had a more even split between, let's say, the 3 big categories. And I think the reason for that I read more adult books in 2018 is that I read more of my own books rather than going to the library a lot. And when I'm at the library, I usually borrow mostly children's books, so, and also some young adult. So this year I just focused a bit more on adult books, I suppose. Then we have fiction versus non-fiction. About 3/4 of my reading in 2018 was fiction, and about 21% was non-fiction. 4 books that I read were a combination of these two, and these are books that combined fictional elements with mostly information. So, for example, I read a children's book where there was a story about a character with ADHD, but you also got some information about ADHD. And I read the life-changing manga of Tidying Up, which contained a fictional story but also contained information elements. Well, those books like that, that's those 4 books that are a combination. I'm pretty okay with this graph. I have had years where I read even more fiction, but I've also had years where I read more non-fiction in comparison. So I think this is pretty good. I read a lot of biographies and memoirs this year, so I think that's part of the reason why there's a lot of non-fiction. This graph shows you each of the genres that I use and their respective age ranges. So blue is for infants, that's the picture books. Red is for children, green is for young adult, and purple is for adult books. And so I thought it was interesting to see that some genres have a mixture of age ranges, but some genres also have just mostly one age range. For example, I mostly read adult science fiction. There isn't much science fiction for children. There is some, but I didn't read any in 2018. The biographies and memoirs that I read were mostly for adults, which makes sense because I don't think there are a lot of biographies for children anyway, specifically. But I read, for example, more children's horror, that is my preference of horror to read. I read a lot of contemporary fiction in either of the 3 big age ranges. I read not so much young adult fantasy and more children's and adult fantasy, which is also my preference. This graph you may have seen before if you've watched my December reading summary. This is the amount of books per age range, but then per month. So I don't have a whole lot to say about this graph because you've just seen it, but in April and in July I read quite a lot of children's books, and this is when I went to the library. That was in April and in July. 71% of the books I read were in English and 29% were in Dutch. I am not fluent enough in other languages to read books in those languages, though that is something that I might want to try at some point. This graph shows you the original language of the books that I read. 62% of them were originally printed in English, 20% of them were originally in Dutch, and 14 were originally in Japanese, then 2% were originally in Italian, 2% in French. Then I also read one book that was originally published in Swedish, one book that was originally written in Spanish, and one book that was originally in Chinese. About 3/4 of the books that I read in 2018 were originally also written in the language that I read them in, and about 1/4 of the books were translated. It is my preference to read a book in its original language, so if the original language is English, I like to read the book in English if at all possible, and if the original language of the book is Dutch, then I like to read the book in Dutch. If the original language of the book is any other language, then I read it in either English or Dutch, and then there's a translation. I do read sometimes translations of English in Dutch. This mainly happens in the library, but I do own some translations as well. This graph shows you the publication dates in a bit more detail. Blue are the publication years of the copy that I read, and red are the original publication years of when the book was written. Unknown and various is when I couldn't be sure exactly of when a book was published or originally published. The graph shows that I mostly read newer books, sort of after 1980 is when there's really much more on the graph. It is interesting that I read more books that were published in 2017 than in 2018, which makes sense because this is over my whole reading of 2018, and I don't always read books straight away after they come out, and often I prefer to wait for a paperback rather than a hardcover, so this makes a lot of sense to me. I also seem to have read quite a few books that were originally published in the 2000s, so between 2000 and 2009, but where the copy that I actually read was published later than that. So a newer copy of a newer edition of a book that was originally published. This graph showed you what the gender was of the protagonist of the books that I read in 2018. 26% had a male protagonist, 45% had a female protagonist, 24% of the books I read had multiple protagonists, in which there were 2 or more genders represented. 2% of the books had protagonists who identified as non-binary, intersex, or any other way of identifying with a certain gender, or no gender at all. And 3% had no protagonists to speak of. These are mainly like information books where there weren't really any particular characters or people involved. Then I read some seasonal themed books this year. I read no books with a spring theme. I call that mainly books that take place around Valentine's Day. I didn't read any books this year with that theme. I read 5 books that had summer as a theme and summer holidays, and I live in the Netherlands, so summer is like June, July, August, and I read 5 books that had a summery theme. Then I read 5 books that had an autumny theme. These are mainly horror books, so I read 5 of those. Then I read 7 winter themed books or Christmas themed books, and most of these I read in December. In this graph I have listed the writing style of the books that I read in 2018. 35% of them was written in first person, 25% was written in third person, and 40% was a combination of these two. These are both books that have first and third person in them, as well as all the graphic novels and manga that I read and comics, because those kind of use both of those, and it's kind of difficult to say what they fall under. So that's why combination is quite a large part of this graph. That's pretty new this year for me. I didn't have that in previous years because I read quite a lot of graphic novels and manga this year in comparison to other years. So then we have a graph about the tense of the writing style. Yes, I am a bit weird. 29% of the books I read were written in past tense, 20% were written in present tense, and 51% was a combination. This is again due to the lot of graphic novels and manga that I read, but also that I read quite a few books which use both present and past tense. So for example, a book in which is written in the present tense, but which also has some flashbacks that are then in past tense. So that's why combination is such a big part of this graph this year. 27% of the books that I read were debut books, and 64% were not the author's debut book. And of 9% of the books that I read, I could not be sure if it was a debut or not. I tried to look it up, but there is quite little information available, mostly about, for example, these older Dutch books that I read, and I just couldn't specifically confirm that. Yeah, so that's why that unknown percentage. Then onto the page numbers. Quite a large portion of the books that I read were less than 250 pages, 60% of them. 35% were between 250 and 500 pages, and only 5% were more than 500 pages. I have read quite a few short stories this year, and also more novellas, and more graphic novels and manga, and those are usually not that many pages. So I've not been reading as many long books as I used to, really. Then we have page length, but then a bit more in detail. As you can maybe see in the graph, about 18% of the books that I read were less than 100 pages. So these are mainly short stories as well as children's books that are sometimes shorter than 100 pages. More than 30% were between 100 and 199 pages, and this is the highest category I have. A lot of manga falls in this category, like a single manga volume, but also a lot of children's books and some memoirs. Then about 24% of 200 to 299 pages, about 17 for 300 to 399, and yeah, once we get past page 400 it really starts leveling off. So 5% between 400 and 499 pages, about 3 between 500 and 599 pages, and then a little bit for more than 700 pages. If you've seen my December reading summary, you will have seen this graph before as well. This is the amount of books I read per month in a pie chart. Yeah, in some months I read more books than in other months. Usually the last few months of the year I never read that many books, because I have a lot of like events and it's festive days and things like that. I've read a lot in April. I think that's when I went to the library as well. So I had some deadlines for the books. And this graph shows the amount of pages I read per month in a pie chart. This is a bit more evenly divided than the amount of books, if that makes sense. This is the amount of books I read per month, but then in like a chart with columns. So this might be a bit of a better overview, really. I seem to kind of go in a few phases. Like in the first 3 months of the year, February stands out, and then April, May, June, April stands out, and then July, August, September, July stands out, and well, October to December are a bit of a different. And then pages per month, it's gradually going up until May, and then it dips down in June, goes up again, July, August, September, and then it dips down again. In this graph, you see the amount of days it took me to read a book in that specific month. And the reason that November is so high here is because it took me a while to read The Neutronium Alchemist, which I didn't fully read in November. I actually read that throughout the year, but that's why, yeah, November is so high. The rest of them are quite a bit lower. And the reason that these numbers are not very high is because I read a lot of graphic novels and manga in one day. Even reading multiple graphic novels or manga in one day because of the readathon that I do with my friends. then the amount of books per day is basically the inverse of the graph you just saw. But then when we look at the pages per day, I think that is a more interesting graph, because yeah, that is a little bit different. Pages per day was obviously a lot lower in the last 3 months of the year, and quite a bit higher in like the other months really. So I'm hoping 2019 will be back higher up. But yeah, I have noticed as well. See, I started my booktube channel at the end of July, so mostly like August, from August on, and it also costs quite a bit of time to make booktube videos and also watch other people's booktube videos, so I think that's definitely cut into my reading time as well. I'm sure I'm not the only one who experiences that. This graph shows you the cover and spine colors of the books that I read in 2018. The blue is the cover color and red is the spine color. So from left to right we have white, black, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple, pink, brown, grey and multi. Multi is for covers that don't have one significant main color but have multiple different colors on the book, on the cover. And NA, or not applicable, is for ebooks that don't have either don't have a cover or don't have a spine or have neither one of those. So that's what I use that category for. And I think it's pretty interesting. Blue is the highest. Now my favorite color is blue, so it's possible that I gravitate more towards blue books. I think in general blue is quite a common color for a book cover. It's interesting as well that for example, I read way more books with black spines than black covers, and the same for red. I read way more books that had a red spine than those that had a red cover. Whereas multi, I read quite a few books that had multiple colors on the cover, but only some that had a multi-spine. Generally the spine of a book tends to be more of one color than the cover has sometimes different colors. So when there's multiple colors on the cover, I pick the main one. But then if there's two colors that are almost evenly used, then it becomes multi. I like that I have at least a few of books in each of these category. I think brown and sort of yellow and orange, those are kind of the lower categories. So yeah, anyway, I just thought it might be nice to track this. Then this graph shows you the amount of words in the title of the book, and yes, I am weird. And this year I thought this would be interesting to track and see what follows, and it's very interesting that apparently titles with 3 or 4 words are the most common in the books that I read in 2018. And it is sort of a curve which levels off like after 5 words, 6 and 7 and higher is not as often used in the books that I read. So I thought that was pretty interesting to see. Now we come to some graphs that show each of the genres versus the month. So we start with fantasy, and in February and April I read quite a lot of fantasy books. That includes also some graphic novels and mangas. In May and September I read no fantasy, and in the other months I read at least 1 fantasy book. So yeah, I thought this was interesting. Then we have science fiction, and I read a lot of science fiction in January, apparently, and a little bit less so in most of the other months of the year, a bit more in October, no in December and February. Then we have contemporary fiction, and I read at least 1 book in contemporary fiction at least every month. This is one of my most favorite genres, if not, it's probably my favorite genre really. And in April I read quite a lot of contemporary fiction. I read a lot of books in April. I think that's also part of the library. If I'm not sure what genre exactly a children's book falls in, I classify it as contemporary fiction, so that will help a little bit for these numbers as well. Then we have rom-com, and I read quite a few of rom-com books in February and in December, but not so many in the other months. Rom-com is kind of, it's chick lit, it's also romance for me, falls under that. It's also books for young adults that involve a lot of love, like a contemporary romance, I guess you might call that. So that's all of what falls underneath this. Then we have historical fiction, and I didn't read a lot of historical fiction books this year. I only read two, one in April and one in July. Historical fiction is not my favorite genre. I don't often read books from this genre. Sometimes I do when I'm in the mood for it. So I'm not really surprised. Yeah, I have to be in a mood for this genre. Then we have literature, and as I said with an earlier graph, these are mainly, I think, literary thrillers. So I guess like contemporary fiction and what other people might call literary fiction and literature, it's kind of, but yeah. Sorry, I'm rambling. I read one book in this genre for some months in the year, so I don't really read classics, so most of these books are actually literary thrillers rather than classics, but I would also classify classics underneath what I call literature. I just don't really read classics. Then we have detective and mystery. I read no detective and mystery books in the beginning of the year, but then the rest of the year I read, yeah, quite a bit from this genre. I like to read it now and then. I should clarify that I have called this genre detective because in Dutch, that's the word for this genre, is detective, but in English it's more known as mysteries. So I will change the name of this graph and make it detective and mystery, but I have not done that for some of the graphs that are in this video, and it would take me a while to like redo all of that because I made the graphs first and then recorded this. So if it says detective in the remaining graphs, then think about it that means mysteries. This graph shows the thrillers that I read. I don't read a lot of thrillers, but according to this graph I still read a few, and I mainly read then Dutch literary thrillers. I don't read so many English thrillers. Yeah, anyway, so in most months I read like one thriller, not in the past few months. I'm really a mood reader, so that's what you can really tell from these graphs. Then we have horror, and interestingly I read one book of this genre in 6 months of the year and no books in this genre in other months of the year. I didn't do a lot of seasonal like horror reading in October. I don't like to read too many books of the same genre in a short time period. So whereas some other people read several horror books in October, I find it difficult to do that, but yeah. Okay, this graph is for paranormal, and other people might call this urban fantasy. I also classify like contemporary fiction books that involve like a ghost or a werewolf or something like that I classify that as paranormal. Although some Dutch children's books that involve that I classify as horror. Anyway, so I read 3 paranormal books this year and one in 3 different months. It's not my favorite genre to read, so I don't read a lot of it. But now and then it can be nice. Then we have biography and memoir, and I read quite a lot of memoirs this year. As you can see, at least one in each month, with several months featuring more than one biography or memoir. Most of them were memoirs, I think. Some of them were graphic memoirs, and others were like textbook memoirs, I guess you could call them. And yeah, this year I was really interested in reading a lot of these, and most of them were about people I find interesting or people who have autism. Mental health was a theme, like yeah, health and illness. Yeah, I read a variety of biographies and memoirs, and I find them pretty interesting to read. So I hope to continue that a bit in 2019. Then we have information books, and for me this is both like self-help books as well as books that contain a lot of information about a specific subject. I didn't read a whole lot of information books this year, but I still read some. I didn't really read many self-help books. Yeah, apparently I read a lot of information books in March and a couple in some of the other months. It really depends on my mood. If I feel like reading an information book or not, I have to not be too tired, otherwise my brain can't like take in the new information. And so it really depends on my mood if I feel like reading these kind of books or not. This graph about Disney is not so interesting because I only read one Disney Donald Duck pocket in December, but I didn't just want to leave it off. I do plan on reading more Donald Duck pockets in 2019, so this graph will hopefully be more interesting next year when I do the summary of 2019. At least I hope to still be on book 2 by then. Now this graph shows you the amount of genres I read per month. So from left to right we have the months, and then the last one is average. From bottom to top it is the amount of books I read, and the colors, again from left to right, contain the genres I mentioned earlier: fantasy, science fiction, contemporary fiction, rom-com, etc. You can read that on the right. Hopefully. I just find this interesting to look at, so yeah. Now the next graph I'm going to show you is using the similar data, but then it is in reverse or flipped around, however you want to call it, which lists the genre on the x-axis and has the months as the things it puts in. So the colors of the columns are the months, January, February, March, etc. And the kind of grey teal color, the last one, is average. And then on the x-axis we have the different genres that I read and I classify books in. And on the y-axis we have the amount of books. So this is sort of the other graph, but then slightly different. Yeah, I just find it interesting to look at graphs like this. The individual genre graphs are better, more easy to look at, but I find it interesting to look at this. That concludes my 2018 reading summary. This was a very fun video to make. The first time that I did this, because I've only been on book 2 since the end of July. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed making this. And thank you very much for watching. I hope to see you on my next video. Bye!